Hi, Misha here, and I've been going back over Russian Soviet aircraft, and it's time to get back to the MiG-21, often nicknamed the Balalaika in Russia, but to NATO known as the fish bed. While not a very inspiring code name, this is quite possibly one of the most famous Russian aircraft of all time, through its sheer use. Interestingly, while it was obviously developed in Russia, pretty much all of its fame as far as service comes from other nations. This was the successor to the MiG-19 and MiG-17, designed to go Mach 2 plus, so very much supersonic. It was designed in the 50s, went into production right at the end of the decade, and was truly refined by the end of the 1960s. Nearly 11,500 were produced. Of those, over 10,600 in Russia, and the bulk of the rest in India. And that's not even counting the Chinese copy, clone, or take on it, the J7. This has been used by at least 60 nations. Some still use it to this very day. It was the most mass-produced fighter after the Korean War, and is the most mass-produced supersonic fighter to this very day, and for some time held the record for a longest production run, though it has been dethroned by newer planes like the F-15. This is not going to be a complete video, otherwise it would be 8 hours. And there are entire books on it, but I gotta give love. So I have two models. They probably look very similar, because they are. Externally, this design, once it was finalized, didn't change a whole lot, but we have on the left a Russian Air Force MiG-21 SMT. And on the right, we have a Finnish Air Force MiG-21 BIS, B-I-S. Yeah, most of the evolution of this aircraft was internal, and with weapon stores. Well, with that, why don't we just dive into the story? Well, the story begins in the 1950s, after a success with the MiG-15, MiG-17, and as the MiG-19 was going into production, the MiG Design Bureau started working on a next-generation supersonic fighter. And they had multiple prototypes, beginning with the YE-1, which was supposed to be a Mach 2 plus capable, but it proved, even on paper, to be underpowered. This would give way to two different ones. You had the YE-2, which was kind of the initial test bed for the engine, and you had the YE-4, which had the delta wing. These would be tested in 1955, 1956, and then combined into the YE-6 pre-production or advanced prototype series, whatever you like, in 1957 through 58 for final testing. And the first production version, which really was a pre-production or limited production, was the MiG-21F. It had an uprated engine from the existing prototypes, but it was still only a daytime fighter. Single seat, single engine. It had two hard points. Mostly it could carry a couple of cannon, and some bombs. And it went into production in 1959. And then in 1960, the first true full production version came out, the 21F-13, made for the new K-13 missile. It had a new radar and other improvements to the design. And this version would be used by both Russia and exported. It would start a whole family of things. For example, the 21PF was a dedicated fighter interceptor version, kind of meant for the PVO, although used by many others as well. Whereas the 21R was a reconnaissance version, although it could be armed reconnaissance. And the 21S, which is this plane's predecessor, had the Sapphire radar. And this is when this started to become an all-weather aircraft, although it always had a limited radar ability. And it always had a short range. It always had limited fuel tankage, although this would be improved with later versions. The 21SM would have several updates to the airframe and also would introduce a new cockpit, ejection seat, as well as an internal gun. Earlier, before they were on pods, they were optional. And then we get to this version here, the 21SMT, which was the same, but it had a saddle fuel tank for increased range and duration. By this point, the original 2 hard points had given way to 4 under the wings, and the missile ordnance, IR, homing missiles had slowly but surely increased. And there's a whole host of versions for both Russia and for export. For example, the original 21S was only for Russia, but then there would be the 21MF for export. And it really did quickly make an impact on the world stage. While both the Russian Air Force, the VVS, and the Russian Air Defense Force, PVO, used it, PVO using the MiG-21P series and Air Force using the 21S and later BIS series, really the MiG-21 became famous from its foreign use, which started pretty early on. I'm going to talk about Finland in just a minute because it's important, but another early user was India, who started looking at the new fighter in 1961, finally receiving its first planes in 1964, and at the time it was India's fastest jet, and they obtained a manufacturing license from Russia. It would make a few different versions over the years. India would first use theirs in limited numbers during the Pakistan War in 1965, and then have them fully fielded for the next conflicts. Generally speaking, they had good success with them, although their accident rate wasn't perfect. They did lose several of the crashes over the years. Nevertheless, India still has some MiG-21s in service, over 100 today. Of course, really where it's famous is Vietnam, and for that I brought out the #1 competition that the MiG-21 had, the F-4 Phantom. These models are Hobbymaster 172 scale diecast. This is an Air Commander. I picked it out because it has the Air Force camo and it was easy to get to. And it really just shows you America thought it would just have complete dominance with planes like the F-4 and the F-105, and really against the older MiG-17s and even 19s they did. But in 1966, Russia shipped in crates and parts several MiG-21s to North Vietnam. These are very quickly put into service and very quickly effective. The airplane is quite a bit smaller than the Phantom, as you see. It's about 48 feet long with a wingspan of only 23.5 feet because of that Delta design. Earlier versions or clean versions could get up to Mach 2, but later versions, especially like this SMT and the Biz with all the extra stuff on them, really did about Mach 1.8. They had a ceiling of between 55 and 58,000 feet, again depending on loadout. They had originally 2 hard points, later 4, and with engine upgrades they could carry about 4,400 pounds. They also could carry 2 drop tanks for extended range. Early versions, though, before drop tanks were available and before extra tankage was put in the fuselage, only could have about a 45-minute endurance. These are meant to zoom up and be a point interceptor. And it really was Russia's first successful fighter interceptor. They'd tried before, but this was the first successful one. And that's what the Vietnamese used them for. They would station them along routes they knew Americans would fly. They would get directions from ground stations. They would fly up, hit the enemy, and before the enemy could recover and bring its superior firepower to bear, they would zoom away. People refer to this as guerrilla tactics in the air. Definitely hit and run. Some Vietnamese pilots, though, still preferred the older MiG-17. They liked that it was lighter weight, more maneuverable, a little more agile, responsive, had a better visibility from the cockpit. On the other hand, those pilots that preferred the MiG-21 in Vietnam appreciated its greater speed, faster climb rate, and more modern guided missiles. And yeah, these typically would have 2 to 4 early on, K-13s, later K-5s, and so on from there. The earliest planes had a couple of guns, then they would delete the guns using gun pods, and then they would go back to one internal 23mm cannon with about 200 rounds of ammunition. Kind of learning that lesson as America did with the Phantom over here. It is near impossible to get accurate numbers, kill ratios for the F-4 versus the MiG-21. American sources claim one thing, North Vietnamese claim another, Russian claim a third. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But this was a small, light, cheap fighter, very basic. And it was very easy to maintain, very easy to train people to fly on. And the fact that it even challenged a cutting-edge fighter like this, which was much more expensive. This is 2-seat, 2 engines, heavily armed. Cost America a lot more in lives and money. The fact that such a little plane could challenge such a big one is a testament enough. In reality, it seems like the F-4 had a bit of the edge, but the MiG-21 definitely got its own, and definitely succeeded where the older MiGs did not. Like I said, it is a single engine, like a lot of Russian designs at the time. It's just one big, powerful engine in the back. It's a tailed delta wing. Interestingly, probably the most unique feature is the nose. It has this shock cone, kind of like a English Electric Lightning. This cone could be adjusted. Early on, it had 3 positions. Later, it had multiple positions, and it was adjusted for the flight speed. The lower the speed, the more it would go in. The higher the speed, the more it would go out. And you'll notice that the pitot tube is kind of canted around it to work with it. Early planes had the tube below the cone, but very early on they would move it to the right side there. There's actually a backup pitot tube as well. It's kind of interesting. And even though these were geared as a fighter interceptor, they still could deliver rockets and unguided bombs, as well as later on TV-guided air-to-surface ordnance. And as time would go on, they would improve things. They would go to a new cockpit canopy design. They would go to a new ejection seat. So the design was far from static. And many of the improvements were based on lessons learned in North Vietnam. It was definitely one of the most aggressive testing places for this plane. North Vietnam would be taking delivery until 1972, having a total of 4 squadrons, using them very successfully, and would keep them in service long after the American War, not actually retiring them until late 2015. And that gets into a lot of things. Even older planes like this SMT have been able to be kept in service, and in a lot of cases even modernized by foreign militaries, because just how basic, simple, user-friendly, and durable the whole damn thing is. And that's really its asset, plus just being lightweight, easy to transport, easy to work with. In fact, even after the MiG-23 came out, a lot of nations who originally were going to get the 23 looked at it hard and decided they'd just keep their 21s, maybe upgrading them some, but they preferred the MiG-21. So what's that say about it? Could very well be the most successful Russian fighter, at least until the MiG-29. But what about some newer versions, like the Biz over here? Well, India was the largest user of the MiG-21 outside of Russia. But actually the first user, at least outside of the Warsaw Pact, was Finland. They opened negotiations with Russia in 1960 for a new fighter. First, Russia offered the MiG-19, which, while not obsolete in 1960, wasn't their cutting edge, of course. Finland checked it out and rejected it. And so Russia came back in 1961 with their newest MiG-21, the MiG-21 F-13. And Finland accepted it and agreed to purchase. In 1962, Russian specialists began training Finnish pilots. This was stopped early because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so Finland finished its own training, putting its 22 F-13s into service, or 21 F-13s into service by 1963. And they would field 22 of them over the years. Ironically, probably mostly against Russia as a defense plane. Now, when the 21 Biz was introduced in 1972, you had 2 basic versions. You had what NATO referred to as the Fishbed L for the PVO, which was a air interceptor, and you had the Fishbed N, which was a fighter bomber for the VVS. There's quite a few important updates with the BIS, but mostly to do with the newer engine, obviously newer radar, newer weapons, wider expansion of weapons abilities, And they finally kind of got the fuel tank situation lined up so that the extra fuel didn't just destroy the plane's maneuverability. Finland was interested, and beginning in 1976, they started to acquire some 21 BIS, ultimately picking up 26 of them. And both planes would serve throughout the 70s and early 80s. They would retire their older ones in the mid to late 80s, and they wouldn't actually retire their 21 BISs until 1998. Other nations would actually modernize theirs. And Russia itself would keep flying the MiG-21 as kind of an auxiliary plane even after the disillusionment of the Soviet Union. The MiG-21 was also used frequently in the Middle East. Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were its primary users. And it first met Israeli-flown Mirage 3s in 1964. The Syrian Air Force did. And at first, the Mirages really owned it. They would improve their tactics to get a better ratio later. A lot of the Egyptian fleet would actually be destroyed on the ground, so much so that by 1970 Egypt had lost nearly over about 100 MiG-21s, and they had to call Russia in for support. Beginning in April of 1970, Russia started flying reconnaissance flights and patrol flights, kind of on Egypt's behest, and they would down a number of Israeli F-4s, A-4s, and Mirages. But then finally in July, Israel got fed up and set up an ambush, destroying 4 Russian MiGs, basically just bloodying their nose and giving them something to think about. Nevertheless, the war continued, and at the end it looked like Russia had lost 5 MiGs and had taken a toll of about 13 Israeli aircraft. I'm not talking about Syrian and Egyptian. Israel was still fighting those and downing those, but yeah. Then in 1973, with the Yom Kippur War, Israel shot down scores of them. Numbers disagree, somewhere between 65 and 75, with very few losses. And then by the 1980s, things just got more lopsided as Israel took possession of F-15s and F-16s. More and more Syrian MiGs would be lost. By this point, Egypt had kind of been fed up with Russia and had allied itself more with the West, so they were out of the game. In Iraq, they were busy engaging Iran. They had a number of MiG-21s in the 1980s that they flew against Iranian planes. Mostly Iran was fielding F-4s and, of course, the F-14. Not surprisingly, the F-14 did very well against the MiG-21. However, one F-14 was shot down, it's said, by a MiG-21. Iraq would lose around 50 aircraft, and Iran would lose about half that. Hard to say, but numbers are all skewed. But the F-4s and the F-14s really gave them an edge. But Iraq had some nice planes too. They had the 21, they had the 23, had the MiG-25 even. But it definitely was in favor of the Iranian Air Force. And like I said, the other Warsaw Pact nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany all flew the MiG-21. And China made their own variant copy, the J-7, which isn't officially counted in MiG-21 variants. Russia would end production in 1985. They had been producing these at 3 separate factories. One kind of specialized in the 2-seat trainer, the UB version. The other 2 specialized in producing for Russia and for export. So it had a very long production run of over 25 years. And as I said at the beginning, a record it held until being surpassed by newer planes like the F-15 and F-16. But it still has many records to its name, including just the high production number. I mean, 11,500 is pretty remarkable. And in service with 60 nations. It wasn't perfect, of course. I mean, it was pretty short-ranged, even the final versions. And it could only carry 4 missiles plus a gun. Or if it wanted the longer range, it would have to sacrifice down to 2 missiles. And that would really lead to the MiG-23 and eventually MiG-29 trying to address some of the perceived shortcomings. But it definitely spanned that gulf, that gap between the 1950s and the 1980s. And without the MiG-21, North Vietnam would not have had anything to really compete against the American F-4 with. As far as the Hobbymaster models, it's the usual. Canopy open close, pilot in out, gear up down. Obviously it's quite small and therefore pretty light because, yeah, size. My only real complaint, the ordnance, because of how thin the wings are, the pegs it uses are pretty small. I recommend just a dot of glue to put them in because otherwise they tend to want to fall out. But other than that, it's a very nice model. Earlier, Corgi sold a MiG-21 model, but the fun fact is, those were actually made for Corgi by the company we know as Hobbymaster. And if you look at a Corgi MiG-21, you can tell it right away. They use a similar stand, and they only really differ in the paint schemes. So pretty much if you want a nice MiG-21 and die-cast 172, you're going to get a Hobbymaster. This one, the Finnish Biz, has been out for a while. The other one here, the Soviet SMT, came out about a year ago, I guess. I just picked it up because I wanted to arm one up with all missiles, and also I wanted a Russian one, even though externally they're extremely similar. They're also coming out with a 21 PFM, PMF, I don't know, there's so many names and numbers for these. But, yeah, one of the intercept versions, yeah. That's one thing I didn't mention. Finland, they did convert half a dozen of their 21 BISs to 21 Ts, which is a photo reconnaissance version. And it would actually fly those a little bit longer. But, yeah, just really neat plane. I mean, it's quintessential Cold War, right up there with the F-4 in terms of fame. Maybe one day I'll do a head-to-head with the 21 and the F-4, but this video is long enough, and I've got plenty of things to do today, so with that, I'm going to let you go, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.